Jim. He's dead.
Hello and welcome to Improv Autopsy. I'm your host, Stephen Cadwell. This is part one of my interview with improviser and playwright Tom Smith. Tom got on my radar through his play Drinking Habits, which is a fun community theater-friendly comedy. When I read it as part of the play reading committee for a community theater I'm connected to, I thought it read like a really good improv scene. There were callbacks and reincorporation of themes and ideas. Nothing was lost. There was a good central game and everything got tied up in a fun and funny way at the end. I did some research and discovered that Tom was indeed an improviser. Not only an improviser, but a director, educator, and author. Tom's book, The Other Blocking, Teaching and Performing Improvisation, was written to fill the void of an instruction manual for instructors. Like most of us who have improv in our blood, his love of improv shows in Tom's work. He's written one-set community theater, budget-friendly shows like Drinking Habits, as well as theater for young audiences and scripts with larger scale in mind. I was elated to connect with Tom because I'm fascinated by the roads that improv leads us down, even if, or maybe especially if it's not to an improv stage or theater somewhere. Tom is a lover of improv, and that did and does express itself in all the other things he has done and continues to do. The improv community is lucky to count him as one of their own. Welcome to part one of Tom Smith's Improv Autopsy. In that educator, playwright, improviser, is there a ranking there in your mind as to who Tom Smith is first, or is it all together?
Yeah, it's tricky because I've had to try to describe myself in various places. I think that how I tend to do it now. So I just retired in May from academia. I was a college professor for 25 years, both in New Mexico and in Tacoma, Washington. And up until that time, I sort of largely defined myself as that, since that was my primary job. But I was also a playwright and a director and an improviser. And then since I've retired now, I just sort of describe myself primarily as a playwright. And improv was always a major component of what I taught at university level. And I still am a huge supporter of improv, but I'm less of an active improviser now than early on in my career, where up until I was in my 30s, I probably defined myself primarily as an improviser who taught or an improviser who wrote plays. But that sort of shifted throughout the years.
Now, your undergraduate and graduate degrees are in theater. When did improv get folded into all of that? When did you first become aware of that aspect of theater?
In 1985, I was in high school. I think I was a sophomore in high school. Yeah, first year in high school. And Seattle Theater Sports came to our high school and did a week-long after-school, hour and a half long, I think, workshop series for free. So I went to that, and I had not heard of improv before then, didn't know anything about it really. And I was just, of course, amazed by it. It just seemed so magical that we were, because I think up until high school, you sort of think theater is doing plays and doing musicals, and that's sort of it. But it was incredibly exciting to think, oh, we're creating this play, we're creating this scene, we're creating these circumstances. And so I was just amazed by it, and it just really impacted me. And so then I got my driver's license, so then I could drive into Seattle frequently to go see Seattle Theater Sports, which I did. And at that point in time, they were, I think, performing maybe Fridays and Saturdays only. And it was great, and I loved it. And then I would bring my friends to come see it with me. And it seemed, especially in high school, it seemed something that felt like a little older in some way. I mean, like there was a bar in this thing. It felt very sophisticated, but it was so much fun and I loved it. And so we started to just sort of informally do it in classes. And then it really kind of took off for me my first year of college. I went to Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington. And there was a classmate there. Her name was Ann West. And every senior had to do a senior project as part of their sort of capstone experience. So she said she wanted to do something with the improvisation. And did anybody know anything about it? And I thought, oh, I know everything about it, right? For as much as 17-year-old can know about it. So she and I sat down. And I said, oh, there's this thing that I did, and there's this form called theater sports, and it's amazing and fun. And so she said, well, will you work with me on this on senior project? I said, absolutely. So then we started a theater sports team at Whitman College. And at that point in time, we contacted Seattle Theater Sports to be like, hey, we want to do this. Is there any problem with this? And they said, well, it's actually sort of a licensed thing. So you need to contact Keith Johnstone at the Loose Moose Theater Company and see if, he'd be willing to let you guys license out. You guys may have to pay a fee or whatever. So I remember we wrote and got a response back pretty quickly and said sort of like, yeah, no problem at all. We're not going to charge you guys anything because you're a college, just have fun. So we did. So we founded Walla Walla Theater Sports at that point in time. And it was a fantastic year. We didn't really quite know what to expect. And we were sort of, again, this is sort of pre-internet. So to get information at all about improvisation, which is largely this sort of oral tradition, we were like, who knows people that improvise elsewhere? And we kept calling Seattle Theater Sports going like, oh, we're playing the same 6 games. Are there other games that you guys can tell us? So they shared with us something called the Living Playbook, which was basically their sort of Bible of games and vocabulary. And so then we would do these shows we put together a team. We had about 30 or 40 people on our team. It was huge. And what was amazing about it was we sort of expected that we would only have theater majors on the team, but we were maybe 10% theater majors and 90% it was a liberal arts college. It was pre-internet. It was in the middle of onion fields at the time. So there was nothing else to do. So we got this really wide variety of backgrounds of people, which at the time didn't seem too strange, but looking back on it, made the team so dynamic because people weren't coming in with sort of actorly habits or, being really fussy about, oh, well, my character needs to have this and this or whatever. And they were bringing sort of expertise in different areas. Somebody would do a scene about science, and that was incredible to me because I was like, no, nothing about science really. So that was great. And then that team, we did some nighttime shows, and then we quickly realized that we wanted to do daytime shows just because so many people had nighttime activities or work or whatever. So we switched over to the lunch hour. So we would perform every 2 weeks from 12 to 1. And we worked with the dining hall, and people that wanted to come see the show could sign up to get a bag lunch that they could pick up so that people wouldn't miss their lunch. So they could come grab a bag lunch instead of going to the dining hall and then come and eat their lunch and watch us. And then we started to get faculty members coming, and we got community members taking their lunch hours to come see us play. And that sort of started the whole journey through improv, was really this college team that just sort of bloomed and blossomed.
Have you ever recommended to anyone, like in the theater department or anything else, we should do the show at noon?
No, although as I've gotten older, these evening rehearsals, noon seems really quite desirable by comparison.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was, and the thing is, it's sort of perfect for that, right? It's a nice break to your day, and people were already on campus anyways.
Yeah.
That's how we got faculty who didn't want to come back to campus necessarily at night.
Right. And it's also, I love that that other people on took their lunch hour to come and watch you, like you said, from the community and stuff. It seems it inspired, even though it was driven by, hey, we want to do other things at night. So let's move this earlier in the day. Is Walla Walla Theater Sports still around in some form, or how long did that last after your senior year?
Yeah. So theater sports lasted maybe 10 or 12 years after I graduated. And then it just morphed into a non-theater sports style improv team. And it's come and gone over the last maybe 10 years, where there's been a couple years with an improv team and then less, but there's still a big, strong improv presence at Whitman College, I believe, to this day, which is kind of cool. And I mean, I don't say that it was us, but I think that there hadn't been anything before we started something. And I'm just happy that, I just think improv, and nowadays it just seems improv and universities go really hand in hand, right? Like most universities have some sort of improv presence. But at the time, again, it was just not what it is today. We just didn't have exposure. There wasn't Whose Line Is It Anyways on TV where people could see what improv was or what short form was. Again, Seattle Theater Sports was just a fairly small by comparison to Unexpected Productions, which is what it is now. None of the improv groups outside of sort of Chicago, LA, New York were really blossoming then. That was a time where, stand-up comedy started to become really popular, and then people started to become even more interested in improv because it sort of seemed connected to that. So I feel like when I started doing it, it was just starting to really blossom in the United States. Obviously, it existed in bigger cities, but I had no exposure to those.
Yeah. Did you do much performing of improv after you left college?
Yeah. So after I left college, I went to graduate school to get my MFA in directing in Kansas City. So while I was there, the MFA program was really comprehensive and they sort of sucked every ounce of time that we had. So there wasn't really, for this 3-year period, anything that I did that was improv related, really. And then after I graduated, I freelanced as a director around the United States for about 4 or 5 years. And during that time, I would sort of do pickup teams. So, like, for example, if I was directing a show in Omaha, Nebraska, I would find out, like, is there an improv class here that I could take or an improv group that I could just sort of jam with? So I started to do that just to kind of, again, sort of stay connected with it. But nothing really kind of formal, just because, again, I was floating around the country. Directing contracts are short, 3 or 4 weeks, versus acting contracts, which are the rehearsal process and the performance process. So theirs are 8 to 10 weeks. So I didn't have a lot of time in places. I finally settled back in Seattle and thought, okay, I'm going to just settle now in Seattle and start a career. And then I started to look at improv at that point in time. So I immediately went back to Seattle Theater Sports, which at that point in time I think had turned into Unexpected Productions. And everything had changed. Before it was like, hey, if you come to our jams, and we have this resident team, but we also have these shows where just people can just, we invite audiences and you can jam. And then when I came back, it was like, well, now we have classes. And in order for you to be on a stage, you have to at least pass through, I don't know, level 2, level 3 of our class. Then we can have a little invited audience. And at the time, again, I was kind of a struggling artist, didn't have a lot of money to spare. And those classes just seemed really prohibitive financially. And so I just never kind of went into what I thought I was going to do, which is, I'll be an improviser for Seattle Theater Sports. Because for me, financially, I just couldn't afford to do the classes. But I did. Then I did that for, like, I was in Seattle for really about a year and a half. And then I got a job. I applied for a job and got a job teaching in New Mexico. And when I got to New Mexico, that's really when I started to teach improv. And I also started to perform with sort of groups that were largely made up of me and sort of like recent graduated students who took my improv class and things like that.
Did that coalesce into anything that is like Walla Walla Theater Sports? Did that become anything, or it just was performances here and there?
It was performances here and there. I sort of feel like I never stayed with a group very long. I was just sort of like coming in. There's a group that I worked with called Arkansas Toothpick Extravaganza. And it was me and two former students of mine who had graduated a couple years before. And we did, I think, a couple runs of shows together. So that was probably the most attached I was to a group. But otherwise, I would drop in. People would say, "Oh, we've got this improv group. Do you want to come in and sort of be like, our monologist for our Armando, or do you want to come in and play some games with us?" So I would just sort of do these sort of drop-in situations, which was great. It made me feel like I was still doing it, but I had always sort of been a little sad that I hadn't been able to find sort of an artistic home doing improv, because I do think that there is really great work that comes out of working with the same people over and over and over again.
Yeah. I think there's something to be said for all of the improv nomads that have been out there as well, though, because without people like you that took it other places and introduced other people to it, as big as this it may have been in the cities, it needed people to bring it to other places and to inspire other people. So there's something there as well. When you say you were connected when you did a run of shows, were those long form shows or short form shows? And at what point in time did sort of long form enter in to your oeuvre?
Long form came in really late for me. Again, early on and in college, we didn't know long form existed. We just knew gameplay, sort of short forms. And so that's what I did for a long time. And then as I got older and I got a job where I had money so I could go visit places that I always wanted to go to and saw different improv teams, I was suddenly sort of exposed to long form, which I was mystified by. And at that point in time, long form seemed to early on for me, long form seemed to be like one of 4 or 5 different forms, like the Herald, kind of everybody was still doing the Herald. And so I didn't really think, oh, there's not much variety here. And then as time progressed and I saw more and was exposed to more, I realized, oh, there is as big of a variety in long forms. So I started really doing long form. And then of course, I loved long form because it was new to me and it was closer to what I was doing as a playwright at that time, which is now I'm going to construct a longer story so we can spend more time learning about these characters and they're not identified by their profession or their funny walk. Now I actually have to give you some sort of background into these circumstances. And I just loved it. And so Arkansas Toothpick Extravaganza was really the first long form group that I worked with. At the time, we were still exploring what kind of long form we wanted to do. So we did, I think, an 8 performance run at a theater over 3 weekends, maybe. And so we said, well, let's do something different every night. We'll do one form that's sort of the same, and then every night we'll pick something that we haven't done before and experiment. And one night we just said, hey, what if we just did like the full show is just a play? We're just going to improvise an entire play from beginning to end. And so at the time we thought, oh, this is great. And this is cutting edge and this is risky. And we had, for that show and that company, we also had a stage manager who improvised sound cues for us. We just gave them at that point in time, a CD that had like, I think 40 different tracks of random sounds. And we're just like, anytime you want to throw anything in, go for it. But we hadn't really rehearsed because the idea of rehearsing hadn't occurred to us really. I mean, we had sort of played around with it, but we didn't actually know that other companies, there was a director, there were note sessions, there was sort of a more formalized rehearsal process. So we did long form. We did this 1 act play. We decided it would be very, very serious. Our audience had no clue that wasn't what they came in for. We didn't do great advertising it. So they didn't really know that it was going to be this sort of serious drama. They came, I think, for short form laughs and didn't get that. And then we were just like, we can never do that again. We can never do that again. So yeah, but when I wrote my book on improvisation, I interviewed a lot of improvisers, people on professional teams across the country, and some international folks as well. And one of the questions I always asked them was like, "Tell me about long form. Like, what are the challenges of it? What are you doing?" And I think I asked them all that question because it was still so new to me, or so new to being something that people associated with improv. Again, I think companies in other cities were doing it maybe more regularly, but it was still sort of new. And that book came out, I think, in like, I don't know, 2001, 2002, something like that. Like it still, we hadn't it, seen examples of it. But then, once YouTube hit and everybody got exposure to what everybody else in the world was doing, that's when it's like, oh, that's what it's supposed to be. Or, oh, that's a really cool long form.
Yeah. When did playwriting enter because you went for directing to graduate school. So when did you start writing plays and like what was that road for you and how, if at all, was improv or did improv influence your playwriting?
My college had a 1 act playwriting contest that they started my second or third year there. And I'd always been interested in playwriting, but hadn't really had any motivation to necessarily do it. But then this playwriting contest came and it paid, I think, $100 if you came in first place. And so I was like, oh, I think I'm going to write a play every year. So I wrote these plays. And first year, I think I came in second place. And the next year, I came in first place. And so I really liked playwriting. And then I would just sort of do it on the side. My school didn't have, it was a small private liberal arts college. It didn't have enough faculty to teach a playwriting class, for example. So I wasn't really ever formally trained in playwriting. And then after graduate school, one of the places I worked at, and actually this started the summer before my senior year of college, I started to work at this place in Colorado called the Creed Repertory Theater. And Creed Rep is in this very tiny town. I think there's only like maybe 500 or 600 year-long residents, but in the summertime, it's this huge, huge tourist area. And this theater started, I think, in 1966, maybe, would do a true repertory, do between 6 and 8 plays, rotating them nightly. Mandy Patinkin was one of the first members of this company way back when. So I had gotten a job there in the box office one year, and then the next year worked the box office again, and they said, hey, we've got these small roles on stage. We'd like to put you in those just to sort of fill out our cast. I said, sure. And then after graduate school, I contacted them again, and they said, hey, do you want to be a director? Do you want to direct for us? I said, sure. So I worked on and off with them for about 10 seasons, and I would often direct. I was their company manager, and then I would direct one or two of their main stage shows. They also had this touring wing, which would, after the season closed, about 4 actors would be cast in 2 or 3 shows, which would then tour Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona for about 3 months. And so I was often, one of my directing assignments was often to direct one or both of those shows. And what would happen is the tour itself was 4 actors and a stage manager and a truck with a trailer, and they were on the road for 4 months. And so the plays that were chosen were often not ideally suited for that limitation. And so the artistic director would say, hey, maybe you could contact the playwright and see if we could cut some of these characters out or see what we can do to make this a little shorter to fit into this 45-minute time thing. So I would do that. And, the playwrights were always pretty gracious about it. But then I said to him one day, I said, look, it would be easier for me just to write you something than it is to try to rebuild something that already exists. And this way we can write to the strengths of what we can do and not stress about the things we can't do. So he said, well, why don't you write me a play and let's see. So I did. And he accepted it. And so that went on tour. And then I wrote probably 4 or 5 seasons. I wrote one or both of those touring shows. And that's really when playwriting became a bigger factor in my life. I was now making money at it, and I had this sort of really great job to do with it. So that kind of got things started. After I went into academia, so if you're a college professor in theater, one of the things that you need to do in order to get tenured at that university is prove that you have some sort of great sort of scholarly output. And so for me as a director, there weren't professional theaters anywhere in the state. So for me to be able to prove that I could, meet this sort of bar of professionalism that they wanted from their faculty, it would mean that I would have to be gone for periods of time. But my department wasn't set up where I could not teach my classes. And so then everything was like, well, then you have to just try to find work in the summer and go off of that. But every faculty member in every university has the same situation where everybody's looking for these summer stock jobs, which are not, they're fewer and farther between than people think. And so it was really difficult to do. So I was like, well, maybe I should just try to build my case as not a director, but as a playwright, because with a playwright, I can send my plays out. They can get produced elsewhere, and I don't have to be there for that necessarily, unless it's sort of a world premiere situation. And if I can get enough professional theaters to do these plays of mine, then I can build my case that way, which is what I did. So that's really when I focused a lot on playwriting, and playwriting then sort of became balanced with my directing sort of background. And then when I transitioned, I worked at New Mexico State for 16 years, got tenure there. and then decided that I wanted to sort of move back to the Northwest. So I applied for a job at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, and I got that job. And so then I had to go through a 10-year process again. And so at that point in time, I didn't even try, even though there were professional theaters in town. I just decided I would continue with playwriting. Number one, because it was still a little bit easier to do that. And number two, I mean, I hate to be crass financially, but if I get hired as a director, I get paid once. If I write a play that gets produced and keeps getting produced, then I'm making money all the time.
Yeah.
Then, if I'm going to spend time working on art, and I love both equally, then maybe I'll spend more time on the playwriting part of it, because that seems to be something that in the long run will help me more financially.
Yeah. You got to eat.
Yeah. So I was doing that, and that's been great. And one of my plays, Drinking Habits, really kind of is head and shoulders more produced than my other work. Probably more productions of that than all the rest of my work combined. And my improv kind of came into that process of playwriting because there are playwrights that work off of creating an outline, and they map everything out, and they figure out the logistics of everything, and then they just sit down and sort of write it. I'm not that person. I'm a kind of writer that I'm usually inspired by some sort of idea or some sort of character or something that makes me think, oh, this would be interesting. But I'm the kind of person that needs to be in a room by myself and play every role and then transcribe what I've played. So this is where I am literally writing through improvisation, because I don't know what the plot is yet. I don't really even know how many characters there are before I start. I just start writing. Usually I write the climactic scene first, because that's usually the core of what inspired me to want to write about this thing or want to write this thing. And so I'm just literally going, hey, why don't you get over here? You can't talk to me like that. Yes, I can talk to you like that. So I'm literally just sort of playing all the roles and then going like, does that sound good? Yeah, write that down. Oh, let me go back and try something, different choices. And it's funny because early in my career, I really liked to write in coffee shops, because then I could overhear conversations and look at people and sort of create stories. As I've gotten older, the coffee shops get too distracting for me, or at least how I write now. It doesn't work well for me to be play acting. So now I just hold myself away in my little office and I just play all the roles. And yeah, so I think that it's very funny in the world when I tell people I'm a playwright and an improviser, because those two things seem to be in direct opposition to each other. And I'm like, no, I mean, that's the big fallacy, right? Like, if you're a good improviser, you're thinking of plot, you're thinking of characters, you're thinking of like, how do we drive to the next important point for the audience? How do I bring something back? Especially towards the end, so that the audience gets this sense of completion, or they go like, oh my God, that's right. Earlier they said this thing. And so when I taught my college classes in improvisation, we would spend a day talking about what creates a good story, like how a playwright works and what are they thinking of. And then when I taught my playwriting class, we always had a day of improvisation where I'm like, the creativity can come from just you riffing with your friends. It can come from you just sort of play acting, like being something in your own space. And so I've always said that those two things are the same coin, just different sides, but they are not. One doesn't have a script, one does have a script. They are not that. There's so many things that overlap.
Well, Second City famously has used improv to write sketch, and hasn't seen it as a performance piece in and of itself, although that's changed this last year. They're actually going to be performing improv, I just learned. But I think it's also a tragedy that, I mean, I love that improv is spontaneous, and it's really, if you're here, you saw it, and it's never going to happen again, what you just saw. And I love that aspect of it, but it's also sort of a tragedy that I feel like every improv group should have a writer with them to be like, okay, if this really sings tonight, let's put it on paper. Let's refine that, because that could be something. And I know from being on play reading committee, the world needs better plays or more. There are a lot of good plays out there. It needs more good plays because, and the same is true for improv. There's a lot of bad out there, a lot of people fumbling through, and that's fine. That's part of any art is learning, and it's flattering that people want to emulate the stuff that they see, even if they aren't great at it. Now, does the success for you of Drinking Habits endear you to that play, or do you like it less because it has become so popular?
No, well, listen. I grew up doing community theater. I grew up doing some plays that are not necessarily the kind of plays that I'm love or would, you know. I'm really open to not hating the child, like so. I've done bad plays as an actor. I've directed bad plays as a director. I've written bad plays as a playwright. Bad scenes as an improviser. I think that's just got to be part of the journey, so that when you do the good ones, you feel like extra special that they're so good. So yeah, I think that I hope that my other plays eventually get as popular as Drinking Habits is, because there's certainly plays that I really love for different reasons. I love Drinking Habits because I think for community, I wrote it specifically for community theaters. And because I was a director for so many years, I also, as a playwright, write in mind of who do I think is really going to end up producing this play, and what financially or cast size wise, or what would be the things that would cause them concern even before reading the play. So I'm not going to put four different sets in any one of my plays, and I'm not going to put a set that's like a grocery store, which I think is just, even if it's just one set, it has 1,000 things in it that's going to make people scared. And so I wrote it specifically for kind of a smallish cast, but medium size, because I know that some community theaters are very small, and the number of cast members, the bigger the cast, the more people will come see the show. But also that there are other community theaters that just can't afford costumes for 16 people or something like that. So I love Drinking Habits. It's now, I think, 21 years old. Like it's the kind of play where I've seen it. Obviously, I've seen some productions of it. And the last time I saw a production of it, which was maybe about a year ago, I said, "Oh, I wonder if I could talk the publisher into letting me rewrite a few things that I feel like go on a little too long, or like maybe I could tighten this up a little bit, or I think I could put a funnier joke in there." So, I don't know that that's possible. And a lot of publishers will say, we're not going to incur that expense, to republish something unless, you're making us millions and millions of dollars. But yeah, so there's parts of it where I'm like, oh, I kind of wish I wouldn't have done this, or I kind of wish I could change this now. But overall, I'm proud of the show. I think it's a fun show. I think that audiences like it. I think that it does what I kind of wanted it to do, which was to give everybody some good laughs, but also to let there be sort of a little bit of a heart to it, so that these aren't just cartoony characters, but there's real sort of something that centers the piece to make it feel like, oh, that was sweet.
Yeah. And I feel like with, Drinking Habits, and again, I can't speak to anyone else's intent, but it seems like that's almost done. Some of those other plays are written for community theater, but not with a love of community theater, and I feel like you can really, and I'm sure it in part was your experience at the Rep where you were writing these for 45 minutes for this touring company out of love for it, and desire for those things to succeed, not just out of the paycheck that you're seeing at the end of the road. And I feel like Drinking Habits expresses that as well. As it's written for community theater, but it's written out of a love of community theater and a love of theater. Some of the other things we notice, and one of the reasons I ask about improv is in reading it, and I would say this is some short form influence, is like, okay, so there's some very clear games that get played that are very fun. And I think that's especially for community theater, those kinds of things are so helpful when you don't have professional actors necessarily. It's like, okay, this character has this thing that I can kind of fall back on a little bit, that both helps me establish the character, but also helps me have fun with it, and then livens up the whole piece.
Yeah, it was important to me that every character had something specific to them. And it's tricky because, the play deals with this sort of group of nuns. And nuns, because they're all dressed alike, quite often people assume that nobody can tell the difference between the nuns and the Sound of Music, except for Maria and Mother Superior. The rest are just generic nuns. So, yeah, I think as an actor, I always wanted, and especially because I was a character actor, I was never going to play Hamlet when I was acting. I was always sort of the goofy sidekick or the best friend or whatever. And I loved those roles. I think that I always wanted there to be something like that, which kind of gives a core identity to the character that then people can play around with, but that feels specific to them and unique to them, and that everybody's got that at least one thing that is unique to them, so that it clarifies the characters a bit for them, or it makes them feel like, oh, I've got this thing that is only mine and I get my laughs because only I do this thing.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of community theater audience as well, that's also helpful. Obviously, it's in determining what characters what, like you say. Yeah, so it's not just there are a lot of nuns and some they
Yeah.
did some things. How many of those plays that you wrote for touring, especially for the repertory company, are those available for people? Is that what some of the 45-minute Shakespeare's are on your website?
Yeah, so I wrote a lot of theater for young audiences shows for Creed Rep, and so a bunch of those are published and available through like Concord Theatricals, for example, and youth plays. And there's a wide variety of sort of the style and the tone of those pieces. Part of what was important for that tour was that we really were reaching elementary through early middle school, and then there would always be a high school show as well. So my elementary school, middle school shows, are sort of adaptations of sort of known stories. Like I've got one called Margarita's Secret Diary, which is sort of three retelling of the Cinderella story through three different cultural perspectives: indigenous perspective, a Latin perspective, and I think as like a Louisiana kind of thing, if I remember right. And then the ones that I wrote for teenagers slash high school were more sort of social issue based. There was one I wrote called ESL, which is about non-native speakers in a high school and sort of the bias and prejudice that occurs because of that. And so those are all available. People can find those and hopefully produce those. And then one of them, I based it off of a long form of improv. So it was really influenced by that. So I have a play called What Comes Around, which is basically based off of a La Ronde. And for those who may or may not know what a La Ronde is based upon this Schnitzler play, this German playwright, where you do a two-person scene, person one and person two, and then the next scene, person two continues as the same character talking to person three, but person two, it may be a different point in their life, or it may have nothing to do at all with the first scene, or it might. And then that scene ends and person three stays and person four comes on and they do a scene together, and then four and five do a scene together, et cetera, until however many people have gone through. And then basically the last scene includes the last actor plus actor number one. So every actor basically gets to play the same role, the same character in two different scenes with different circumstances. So we can kind of see this trajectory of how they may differ depending on who they're talking to and what's going on with them. And so I wrote What Comes Around as a La Ronde. So it's a group of high school kids, and we see them sort of in these two-person scenes, and we see them interact with different people in different circumstances. So that one was entirely 100% influenced by the fact that I was playing a lot of La Rondes in improv at the time.
I love that. Did the play predate the movie? Because I don't think I've was aware of the play, but I have seen the La Ronde film, which is a black and white French film, I think.
Yeah, so the play was, yeah, like 1890s, I think.
Okay.
So it was sort of the originator of all of that. And there's been, a ton of movies and Broadway plays that sort of use the same format of a La Ronde because it's just an interesting format.
As someone who I presume you also go and you consume theater. You view theater as well, right?
Yeah.
How do you watch theater? How is that experience different for you as a playwright, director, and improviser versus a lay person?
It's a great question because it's really sort of changed throughout my life. So there was a point in time where my work study job in college and a job that I did a little bit after college was like as a props artisan. And when I was doing props, it was impossible for me to watch a show and not evaluate the props. And I would sit there and kind of mutter to my friends, like, there's a UPC symbol on this, but that wasn't invented yet, or something like that, right? Like, I was a horrible person to see a show with because everybody's trying to enjoy the performances and the plot and, the things that they should be there for. And I'm worried about that tea kettle doesn't look as distressed as it would for those people at that time. When I got more into directing, it's tricky for a traditional audience member who has no theater background to really kind of even know what a director does unless the director is doing some big out of the box approach to a show. If you're just seeing straight realism, they have no idea what a director is what their job is, right? And so as a director at the time, I understood that they, what choices were really within their purview to have made. So if there were things that I felt like, I might have not had her in that costume, or I might have changed that light cue to not do that. So I was analyzing more than enjoying shows. I think once I got into my late 30s and 40s and I felt more established in my own career and what I was doing, I really became much kinder to fellow artists. I became far less critical because I'm like, good for you. I'm sure you had, budget issues, or I'm sure like that was what you had to work with. And good for you. Like, I became a real champion of art because I was meeting it where it was at and not trying to analyze it and play critic and say what it should have been or what I would have done. And so I've become a much kinder, friendlier audience member now. And I think as a playwright, I listen more carefully now to word choice. And I'm trying to always balance in my head, like, did they write that in? Or is that something that the director and the actor decided to do? Or like, is it supposed to be this way? But I feel like as a playwright, I understand that just by the mere fact that somebody is doing that play means that there are people who in the organization who not only think it's worth doing and worth spending money on doing, but are choosing for their particular audience. And their job is to know who their audience is, to know what their community is, who's going to come out and support this piece of art. And so I just have to shut up and say, well, I may have made different choices, or I don't know that I would have had that happen that way, but I've got to just say, but I'm sure, obviously, by the fact that this play is being produced at all is such a great achievement that I've just got to give them the benefit of the doubt and say. The other thing is, I also believe I was like this in improv, and this is what I actually learned. One of the biggest things I've learned in improv is I'm not in competition with the other people. In improv, like, the worst thing you can do is try to be the person that wants to be the funniest, or the person, that gets the biggest applause, or that creates the biggest moment. Because at that point in time, you're not working together as an ensemble. And that's really what is going to tear the scene to shreds. And it becomes a stressful, horrible time if somebody's just grandstanding all the time. I've learned that in the arts, there's room at the table for everybody. And you may do what I'd never want to do. And I may write the kind of things that you think are crap. And that's okay. We can still support each other and still say there is somebody out there who's going to look at this work or read this play or do this thing to the best of their ability. And that's hard to do. Art is so hard to do. And you give up so much to do it, of your time and your energy and relationships with friends and family, when you have to say things like, I can't, I've got rehearsal. That, we've just got to champion all things because it's just hard. And we, as artists, should applaud each other the loudest, whether or not we agree with everything that was done.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if egalitarian is exactly the right word, but I love that view of it, and it reminds me of a couple things. One, especially as you were talking there toward the beginning, was that a view that Neil Simon definitely didn't share. My my wife was good. They were going to do Rumors in their high school, and they got a cease and desist from Neil Simon when he was still alive, saying, "No, you can't change the language in this so that you can do it in the high school." So they never did, but that's fine. I guess that's his prerogative. But I'm also thinking about what you said about writing your plays, Drinking Habits, for community theaters. And what you didn't say, and I think this is telling, is you didn't say, so I had to make it less complicated. I had to make the themes less meaningful. I had to make it less art. What you said is, I was concerned about the number of people. I was concerned about sets and things that resources of the community theater might not be able to provide. It wasn't, I have to worry about the talent pool or any of that. You're challenging them just as much as you would a professional acting company. It's just we're doing it with a smaller budget.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I mean, some stories can't be told that way, but as a playwright, knowing who I wanted to produce this play, I wanted to not offer barriers that I felt like didn't need to be put in there. The same way that I do a lot of my other plays, especially now when I write for different groups, there's a lot of sort of characters who don't have to have a specific gender in the description because it's just not that important.
Yeah.
And there are genders that aren't being written for right now, in plays and musicals. And I don't want there to be this is where TYA is so ahead of the game. So Theater for Young Audiences plays say, look, we get that the high schools are our audience, right? They're the ones that are going to produce a lot of these plays. And we get that by and large, most high schools have a much larger percentage of non-male actors auditioning. So for us to do a play that takes place in the army in 1950, we're just going to still cast people that aren't men in these roles. So do you want that to stand out? Or do you just want to not write that? Write it as an allegory instead, or set it in a different universe or whatever to make it easier, or just say up front, as most TYA plays do, like, the names of these characters are their last names. We don't care who you cast. And that's so different than plays that are written for a traditional adult audience, where it's like, still in the front page, you get their age range and their gender, and their name is usually tied into their gender in some way, where for you to cast somebody of a different gender, it would seem like the audience is like, why is he called Betty? I don't get it, or whatever. So I think that that's where playwriting is sort of moving towards now anyways, I think, is the idea of not creating such strict boundaries especially in terms of casting. But also, I think if you need it, you have to put it in there. And if you don't need it, then why prescribe it?
Yeah. And a lot of even on Concord, a lot of times it'll say, you cannot change the gender of you can cast someone else, but the character is this and has to stay that. I mean, they're not dictating casting, but they are saying the character still has to be whatever. And I know it says on your website that you like to write about identity. And I think that makes total sense, especially for TYA. I mean, if there's a time in your life when you're really trying to figure all that out, those are the ages when everything's coming at you hard and fast and you're trying to make sense of all of that. I also feel like improv is there's a reason why so many people are drawn to improv in an identity kind of way, because when you're on an improv stage, when you don't have a casting director or you're not being cast in a certain role, you can play anything and be anybody. And it's really freeing as a performer in that way, because you can be things on the improv stage that you would never be accepted as in your work life or wherever.
Right. Yeah, 100%. And what's interesting to me is seeing how that is all evolving and changing. Like when I was improvising in my 20s, the whole thing was like you could be anything, anybody. And we would do things on that stage which I would not do today because we are different people today and the world is different.
Yeah.
And it was always scary to not come off completely cliche back then. Like anytime we had a woman on our team, we would sort of internally say, what don't you want to do? And 100% of the time, it was like, I don't want to be pregnant again. I'm so tired of, I have to be the pregnant one in every scene, right? And then we started to think like, oh yeah, actually it would be kind of funnier if you weren't the pregnant one, right? Like, can't we flip expectations? And they're like, and I don't want to be sort of the person that just goes on second and has to support whatever else somebody's already established. And like we were dealing back in the 80s, 90s with just gender equity in terms of playing and racial. Oh God, if we had a Latina actor in our group, the types of roles that they would play, either because we put that upon them, or they would just sort of roll their eyes going, well, if there's this type of character, of course, that has to be me, and at the time and in that world, it seemed to be not so unique or not so different. And now, like when I was in both universities, I was sort of the faculty advisor for the improv teams, that were for those schools. And just the types of care and the types of difficult conversations that need to be navigated throughout the years about like this person said this, and you're like, I know, but did they do it purposefully? Because like in improv, you don't have the luxury of re-editing what
Right.
may have just come out of your mouth. And so, how do we sort of identify these moments that may happen in a live performance and shift them so that this person isn't embarrassed by what they just said, or people aren't so offended by what's just happened that they want to leave the show? If the kinds of conversations around care, which are so important, really has come into improv much more vocally with sort of newer generations of improvisers, which is great, but it's so tricky. I always say, like, I feel like I would have a much harder time improvising with 20-year-olds than I would with 40-year-olds, just because I think that the types of approaches and types of games and types of things changes. And like, I don't want to sound like the old man here, but I appreciate so much sort of the new styles and systems, but I also see how sometimes it can get in the way slightly of really feeling completely free on stage. And it was that freedom that I love so much about improv. And they still
Yeah.
have that sense of freedom. It's just a different type of freedom. It's a freedom with more thoughtfulness than when we did it. So it's a different thing. Improv has changed and just conversations have changed. And I think all of that is super great.
Yeah. I'm an advocate for diverse ages in improv groups because I feel like we do have a lot to learn from each other. And as someone who is also, I was never as in touch with pop culture as I was when I was performing shows regularly in Orlando, because the audience brought a lot to me to educate me about
Yes.
stuff that I would never have known anything about otherwise. It's like, well, I'll look that up later, but yeah, we'll do a scene about it now that I'll fumble through, and you'll laugh at me, and that's fine.
Yeah. I love that though. I always say that's what sort of kept me sort of young at heart. Is it wasn't like I was dying to watch TikTok. It's just they kept popping up in scenes. I was like, what the heck is TikTok? There's so much of pop culture that I feel like, I mean, it's also being surrounded by people in their 20s, for my day job, for so many
Yeah.
years. I feel like, you're sort of rolling along with them so that you don't get left behind. But yeah, I think especially in improv, that's where all of that stuff came out the most, because they would make references to things, or they would say something that would get a giant laugh. I'm just like, I'm not sure I know who Charlie XCX is, or whatever, right? So I did the same thing. I was always sort of constantly trying to keep up with the kids, so that I could work with them at the place where they're at.
When you think about improv in terms of how you think about performance or art or theater, where does it fit in all of that? Like, where does that pie piece fit in your theater thinking?
I think that when I look at the totality of my career, I don't think I would be as successful of a playwright or a director if I didn't have this huge improv background, and if I wasn't actively teaching improv. Definitely as an academic, improv was sort of a core identity, who I was, especially as a teacher of acting. I mean, the whole reason why I wrote this book was because when I first started teaching, every acting teacher was teaching improv like in their acting one class, but none of them had any background or training in it. And so for them, improv was just like, we're going to play this game, and then they wouldn't give them any feedback of how to make it better. And then when I started to work there, I would say, oh, there's theory behind this. There's actually academic theory. There's vocabulary. Like, you could tell them to say yes to things instead of saying no to things. And I think that it takes them into a place that's less expected, and you'll get better scenes. They're like, well, will you just come in and just, teach some guest classes for me? So I started to do that a lot. And then I went to my first academic conference for an organization called Association for Theater and Higher Education, which is sort of like this national conference for teachers, professors of theater. And I said, hey, I want to do this thing on improv. Anybody else want to do it with me? Only one other person replied, and there were like over 500 members of this thing. And so we did this little panel on improv and approaches to improv. And we had like, I don't know, 80 people show up to our thing, and everybody was taking notes. And I realized nobody knows how to teach improv. Everybody is teaching improv. Nobody kind of knows how to make it better or what to do with it. And so then I started to do more papers and presentations at these conferences about like just teaching them things that you would learn if you went to any sort of improv workshop or class now, basics of performance for improv and approaches and styles of games and what a semester-long improv course could look like. Because people are like, after one class period, I've done everything I know how to do. And so I just compiled basically all of these discussions and stuff into this book. And so it's really not necessarily intended for an end user of improv, not necessarily for the performer, but more for people who are teaching potential performers of improv. Like, nobody ever trained me on what makes a good MC for a show. And yet there's an MC at a lot of shows.
Yeah.
Always just like the person, like, are there ways in which we can help people teach improv with the same academic seriousness that we do an acting one class where we're teaching, Stanislavski or Michael Chekhov or whatever? Like, why is improv still sort of the playful one that doesn't need any sort of instruction? Now we're going to do scenes where it's just like the only difference is the scene has scripted lines, but creating the character and making choices and being brave with your choices and not freaking out if your choice isn't a good choice. Like with the improv, I always say what everybody gets out of that class, if nothing else, is that any choice is disposable. And you may really want to do something one way and the scene's not going that way, so you can't do that thing. And you just have to kind of let that go, the same way that you may be in a rehearsal process and really want to do this thing with this moment. And the director says, no, we're not doing it that way. Or you're wearing this instead, so you can't do that, or whatever. So I think in the world of academics, I was known largely as the guy who always taught a bunch of improv stuff at these conferences. Yeah, so I think it's right now, if I were to cut the pie, I would say probably right now, maybe 50% of my identity artistically is as a playwright, probably 25% as an improviser slash teacher of improv. Maybe I'm going to bump that up to maybe 35 now that I'm putting the teaching of improv in with that. And maybe 15% as a director slash generic professor of theater.
I love your goals in that, and that there has been and hopefully still are people that were advocating for teaching people how to teach improv, but also getting improv into college theater education. My introduction was improv as theater, not improv as comedy. And I think that's something that academia can offer theater students is you don't have to go to IO, you don't have to go to Second City, you don't have to go to UCB and be taught how to do improv as something different. Improv is theater. Get grounded in that first, and that'll make the other stuff better.
Yeah, I think that for me, there's no difference between teaching improv and teaching stage combat or commedia or singing for the actor or other classes that support the acting process. I think it's super important to not think of it as a different thing. It's just a basis of approach that can be applied to traditional scripted acting that can really help improve people's abilities, the same way that any of those other kind of more specialized classes can.
That's it for part 1 of my interview with Tom. Find out more about him via the links in the show notes and more about me and my Patreon. If you're looking for a play to mount or part of a play reading committee like I am, check out Tom's plays on his website or via Concord. You could do worse than producing a Tom Smith play, okay? Go watch or make some theater and come back to listen to the second half of Tom's interview. Thanks for listening to Improv Autopsy.